And Mada Asir al-Alam is a very famous book. For those of us that know like Tablighi Jamaat, they're Fadaili Amal, the book which they love a lot. In the back of there, even this example here of the degeneration of Muslims and the effect it has on the world is also recorded there as well. It's a very famous book. Mada Asir al-Alam means how did the world kind of lose out because the Muslims went into decline. He starts his book with by setting the scene of how the world was when the Prophet was born. Then he goes into the Prophet Islam, revelation, how Islam transformed the world. Then he looks at the glory of Islam, how Islam had glory days, and then he looks at how we declined after that and how that affected the world. So on the screen, you should just be looking at it. So the Prophet he was born into a certain world, and this is so important because you can only understand the loss of Islam leaving when you understand the benefit that Islam brought. So we'll look I don't want to get to the end of this. So we're going to look at the Roman Empire, Persian Empire, and the Arab world. We'll start off with the Romans in China. And the reason we're looking at this, just to have a bit of an overview, is because the Persian Empire, obviously, if you look at Arabia here, this is Mecca, it's almost surrounded by the Persian Empire on that side, on the east, and then the west, obviously, you have the Roman Empire. At that time, these were the two greatest empires. These were like the superpowers of the world, the Romans and the Persians. Obviously, you have other parts of the world, but in terms of being close to where the Muslims were going to start from, the Persians and the Romans were the closest. And being the superpowers and being the kind of having the most civilization, when you look at their way of living, it's a good understanding of how the rest of the world was also living. So the Roman Empire, religion, I guess, of the Roman Empire, or the Romans? Christians. Yeah. So the Romans were generally Christians. And when we think of Christians, we like them because they have this. What was the one thing Christianity originally came with, which is Isa and Islam also kind of came with? Tawheed, the oneness of Allah. Unfortunately, that was lost. In Mada Hasr al-Alam, says that Saint Paul, he really contributed towards Tawheed, leaving Christianity. There was a point where Christianity kind of moved towards Tawheed, but the way Saint Paul influenced Christianity meant that Tawheed was kind of lost. Now, when he quotes Orientalist scholars as well. So scholars who studied Islam from the West, very often Western scholars, they studied Islam, so he quotes them. There's actually a translation of the Quran, and it's written by somebody called George Seerah. And this in Britain was the most famous translation of the Quran. And obviously, whether it's reliable, he didn't actually use Arabic. I don't think he understood Arabic. He used another translation of a language he understood and translated from there. It's not amazing translation. And he describes, in his translation, he starts to describe the condition of the Christians at the time when the Prophet was born. And this shows us how they had come away from Tawheed. They had come away from the oneness of Allah. Obviously, we know that when we think of Isa as not just being Isa, but kind of being the three things. The Holy Spirit, the Trinity, isn't it? So there's three things they make up, and they all kind of have this divinity within them. It kind of takes away from Allah Himself. Now, the second, what he mentions in his translation of the Quran, he says of Christianity, the worship of saints and images. Basically, Christianity had moved away from worshipping Allah, and at the time of the Roman Empire, a lot of them were worshipping images, and the saints themselves, the imams, we became the people who were worshipping, unfortunately. They completely turned away from Allah, and they really got their priorities upside down. And this is really important because when you think of the goodness of a group of people, especially from an Islamic perspective, we generally think if they worship an Allah, if they have a divine being who they look to, they have some kind of morals. They have some kind of place where they go to get their morals. But when we look at the Christians, even if they claim to believe in God, when they start worshipping pictures, then that kind of goes away. So that's one of the problems. That's one of the problems of the Christian. Generally, with the Roman Empire, even in terms of their kind of just social life, in general, having enough to eat, cost of living, they had different crises. To the extent that in about he's written 532. So when was the Prophet born? So we're trying to understand when he was born. What year was he born? 57? 570 or 571, somebody's an expert. So 570 or 571, this is what we have. 532 is one of these incidents, search from Wikipedia. On Wikipedia, it's known as the Nika riots. When it's referenced in Arabic, a lot of this is a reference to a book of history in Arabic. And what happened there is 30,000 people were basically killed because of these riots. And there's different kind of narration as to the reasons behind why these riots happened. One of the reasons which is given for these riots to take place was actually because there was like an ikhtilaf between the Christians. So you had Christians who believed in Isa as divine and as or had a bit as a spirit. But some of the Christians, they didn't believe that. They believed that he was just a spirit. He didn't have the human element. He was just completely divine. They had both of these elements when they understood Islam. This led to a lot of problems. And Hercules, or Heraclius, who was the king of the Romans, he made a point to prosecute these types of Christians. So they had a real kind of debate, to the extent that there was a civil war within the Roman Empire about these people, how they believed Isa. Was he divine, or was he human? Was he both? And based on that, they had civil wars with themselves. In terms of the general finances, people would kind of come on the streets and riot against the government. And again, these were those Christians who believed that Isa they believed that Isa was part divine and part human. This is what Heraclius believed. The people he persecuted believed that Isa was completely divine, that he didn't have this human element. And this caused like a civil war, and this was at the time of the Prophet. The reason this is important is because when we think of a civilization, especially like the Roman superpower, they have things like libraries, schools, hospitals, lots of infrastructure to support an economy. However, what we find with civil wars, as soon as the civil war breaks out, all of these things which were created to support the economy, the hospitals, the schools, and the libraries, even the monasteries, even like the churches, they become used for the war. So the army is now focusing all of the infrastructure to defend itself from the what they call the rebels. And the focus now, they're not thinking about building roads and building the economy. They're focusing on survival. So these are just some of the incidents from the Roman Empire, and how even within the capital of Rome itself, the Nika riots took place. And this is basically their taxes went up. So when they're having a civil war, they're going to have to fund this war. The only place they have to get money from is the people, the hardworking people. And especially the peasants of society, they would end up paying this tax so that the leaders could carry on investing in their own civil war. Another thing the leaders would do is waste money and have a lot of treasures, and that's like a separate chapter which we'll come to. But that's just a bit about the Romans. A little bit about the Romans. This is start us off. The second section, the second superpower was the Persians. Because we want to look at the two superpowers, and then Arabia. Arabia is where the Prophet was actually born. The Persians, religion, Zoroastrian, what would they worship generally? What was the Zoroastrian religion? Fire, generally worship the fire. And where is it located in the world? Now, country nowadays, sorry? Iran. Yeah. So Iran is known as Persia. Obviously, it's not actually Iran. Iran was recently, but it's Iran and the places around it. And they all basically be one with fire worshippers generally, and they worship fire. Again, from a spiritual perspective, the problem we have with people who worship fire is that, again, where do their morals come from? So they don't have divine morals coming. They don't really have a messenger. They're not trying to even follow the teachings of the messenger. They're taking the fire and doing whatever it kind of tells them to do. So the most famous problem with the Iranians was actually incest. So it was very normal for them to get married to each other, basically, in simple terms, very normal. To each other, within siblings, within like up and down as well. So like fathers, and then there's different narrations you get from history. You know, where people will kind of be with their kids and then end up killing their kids and stuff like that. But I mean, in our society, that would be strange and weird, and like sometimes happen. But in Persian society, it was within the law. They had laws for this kind of stuff to take place. I'm not going to go into more details. But that's the kind of thing they had. And this obviously causes problems within your relationships. You're trying to create family, trying to create society, and there's that kind of problem which happens. So what happened many years before the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam? This was a normal part of their culture. There was a guy called Mani who basically gave a fatwa in the Persians. And it was a very complicated fatwa. Some people understood that apparently. And he said that because evil and guidance, they have a conflux. So basically there's lying and there's evil, there's goodness, there's bad. There's dhulumat. Right now we're talking about dhulumat of the world. Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam came in line. This guy had a philosophy, a very strange philosophy. You don't have to accept it. His name was Mani. And he says that basically because evil and light are a conflux, if we get rid of humans, we stop producing humans, we get rid of the evil over time because the evil comes from humans. So he basically encouraged not getting married and basically not having kids, whether marriage was involved or not. He said everybody should stop having kids, and that would solve this problem of evil and stuff like that. And he made this big fatwa, and he was actually extremely influential in the Persian Empire. He was so influential that he had to be publicly beheaded. He was killed because of his views, but his views had their effect on the Persian Empire. It's interesting because he came around in about 300. The Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was born 570. In about 300, he was killed in 276. His effect was so much that after he died, there was another movement called the Mastakit movement. And if he was saying that you need to stop having humans, and we need to stop having like sex, basically, we need to stop creating more humans, people apart. It's a life of celibacy, living on your own, no kind of sexual relations. Then there was like an opposite movement which was created, and this is what describes the Persians at the time of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. This opposite movement, what they came and did is they basically revolted against the leadership one with this fatwa who is so kind of sex. They revolted against his, and the way they revolted is by we'll come to the treatment of women in a minute. But the way the world was is that women were kind of possessed and ruled by men. So the way they revolted is by offering everybody wealth. It was an equality. Like we have a bit of, we have this kind of, in some aspects of liberalism, you have this demand for everybody is exactly the same. So the equality movement was everybody is given wealth and layers in order to get rid of this inequality in the world, where only the rich have access to this. So they went around giving this away. And obviously, as you can imagine, there was no such thing as marriage. It was like just live your life. And in the Persian Empire, the point we're getting to is the way they considered pleasure. Like they just the main purpose in life was to have pleasure, as much pleasure as you want, and that's why this fatwa took off. It might take off in many societies actually, that kind of a fatwa. But it actually took off and people actually acted on it, and then suddenly everybody was kind of fulfilling their desires as they wanted, and there was nothing, and people were given this. People were given this freely. People were given this around them. So just like everyone has access to water and fire and that kind of stuff, and air to breathe. They wanted the right to wealth and woman to be the same as them, and what that led to is a society where everybody, it actually meant that people could kick other people out of their house. Nobody actually owns any wealth. All wealth belongs to everyone. Nobody's in charge of it. It was that kind of a thing. Obviously, it doesn't make sense. It's against our Islamic ethos of work hard for us. But it led to a kind of, nobody has to do anything. And even the parents didn't have like a status over the kids. That makes sense. Everybody's equal, remember? So the parents didn't have that with the kids. The kids could keep the parents out of their house. It was that kind of balance. That's what it kind of led to. And this, kind of this revolt was quite strong. So these people, they kind of go with the king and they actually managed to push this. This is the Persians at the time of the Prophet. Generally, they would have a lot of love for their king, just like the Romans, but the Persians would really hold their kings in very, very high regard. They would consider their kings to be divine, almost like godly. So you can't do anything against the king. Everything the king says is well. You have to respect the king. You have to look after the king, and the king is basically perfect. And that's what they kind of go to. Obviously, worshipping fire caused a problem because when you worship fire, you don't really have that. You don't really have any morals. You're taking your rules from this thing which you look after yourself, and you're kind of creating it and all that kind of stuff. The Christians, remember, were worshipping very often pictures and statues. But those are the two main superpowers. So the Christians and the Persians. So if you have a little look at the map, you see we've covered the Persians and the Christians. Also, if the Muslims, obviously here's the ocean. So if the Muslims were to kind of conquer and take over, they would run into the Persians and the Romans very quickly. This is why we notice that towards the end of the life of the Prophet, they start heading towards the Romans. And obviously after the Prophet passes away, they have a lot of kind of duels with the Romans and the Persians. So the one group of people we're going to study now are the Arabs themselves. So we notice that the Persians didn't kind of conquer the Arabs, nor did the Romans. Many historians say this kind of weren't worth conquering. But that's how kind of people perceived the Arabs. They weren't really that educated. They weren't civilized. They weren't as the way that the Persians had developed themselves and the Romans had developed themselves as the proper civilizations. The Arabs were still living in tribes, just in a tribal kind of way. But that's it from the. There's a lot back here. We have time. But mainly we need to focus on the so there's Arabian bit here in the middle. Now, when Abu Hassan Nadwi in his Mother Hassan starts talking about Muslims, starts talking about the Arabs, he actually starts with some good points. The rest of the world, he really does describe the world as a dark time, very dark. This is the worst time of the world. The 6th century, according to him, historians agree that this was the worst time of the world. It was like, well, obviously he means morally, like everybody was morally bankrupt. The Romans were worshipping their things. They had like a few rich people. Then the middle class, the working class, would kind of support the corruption of the leaders, and that's how the world run. With the Persians, it was similar. The kings were ruling, and the kings were corrupt, and with their corrupt judges and leaders, they would allow a corrupt society to run. And then they would just basically milk money in taxes from the poorest of the poor, and they would basically be the peasants. We probably won't have time for India, but in India we probably know they had this thing which really helps create divided society known as the caste system. So in India you have this caste system where you have like peasants based on where you're born, you're not allowed to have any kind of interaction with anybody. Some people are born as teachers, some people are born as rabbis, some people are born as leaders, and that's what was really in the world. And even with the slavery, we see that's what existed even within the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, and obviously Arabia as well. So when they start speaking about Arabia, some of the things which they mention as good points are that the Arabians were brave. They were good horsemen. They were generally good at war. They were honest. They were amazing with language and poetry. They had good memory. They memorized things, and they had a lot of honor, and they valued freedom. These are some of the good points he starts off with. However, he summarizes all of this with the fact that the Arabs had also been deprived of any prophets, also for many years as well. So there was a fatara, there was a period without any revelation, without any prophets. So morally, they didn't have a proper source. They didn't have like a divine text. They didn't have somewhere to get their morals from. So this was one of the problems with the Arabs. Now, with regards to their tawheed, they believe in the oneness of Allah. Even in the Quran. So when we study the Quran, we notice that very often the Quran does actually refer to incidents which happened before the Prophet was born. For example, Surah Al-Fil, that's an obvious one. Surah Al-Fil, it speaks about this incident. The Prophet is not born yet, but it speaks about the elephants coming to destroy the Kaaba and how Allah saved them. As well as that, the Quran does refer to the condition of the non-Muslims in the Quran. For example, for us to understand the tawheed of the non-Muslims, even though they had put their idols, as we know, in the Kaaba, they had hundreds of idols in the Kaaba. And there's so many stories we find about the people of Arabia. Even though they had their idols, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَئِنْ سَأَلْتَهُمْ مَنْ خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. If you were to ask them who created the earth and the sky, لَيَقُولُنَّ اللَّهُ لَيَقُولُنَّ اللَّهُ. They would definitely say, Allah has created the earth and the sky and everything around them. So they had this, but according to historians, it was just lip service. They only knew Allah as like just a thing. Whenever they worshipped, they would always worship the idol itself. And there's many stories about their idols. There's so many things about their idols. And these idol stories, a lot of them are mentioned in some of them I say Bukhari. And some of them are in this other book. So there's a book which is actually called Kitab al-Asnam. A lot of them, Kitab al-Asnam is a book which was written, and it's a very boring book. You probably don't want to read it. But it's got the sanad, and then it gives you the isnad, and it tells you like which tribe of the Arabs had which idol. So in there we get loads of stories about how the Arabs used to worship idols before the Prophet ﷺ. And it kind of gives the name of the tribe and how they worship. And you have different stories, like some of the companions, they would say that we used to worship stones. And if we found like a stone which looked nicer, then we'd just take that stone. It was more beautiful. And again, in these books, you get narrations where the idol worship would be traveling, and in order to cook, they'd have to collect stones to put the pot. So they'd get 4 stones and use 3 for the pot, and the 4th one they would worship. So that would be the form of worship. So it's kind of a strange way of worshipping. Most of the Arabs would have an idol for their house, and then a separate idol for Kaaba, and then a separate idol for different things. So idols were just something which they could buy and sell, and not everyone could afford these beautiful sculptures. So if they couldn't, some of them would just make it out of the dust. So they'd gather some dust together, like stick it together, almost like kids would make a sandcastle, and then they'd worship the sandcastle which they made. So it's kind of their polytheism was very strange. And they would worship anything and everything. And the problem with that extent of polytheism, or the problem with all shirk, especially this one, is that it completely takes you away from Allah. There's no awareness of Allah. There's no notice that there's actually God we're worshipping. There's somebody watching. That goes away. And that was what really caused problems for them when the Prophet actually came. And in terms of the way that they behaved, 2 things were very common. One was drinking alcohol. So it was like more common than water for them to drink alcohol. So all of these leaders, even when they would come together to decide like whether to go to war or whether to rebuild the Kaaba or whether to have a new idol or whatever, whenever they would have those discussions, most of them would be drunk as well. So they'd be making these decisions in a drunken state. Another thing which was very common was, which had also to do with their pride, was gambling. Gambling was something very, very common in the Arabs. And it was like something which would decide the dignity you had in the people around you. So if you gambled, the more you gambled, the more like cool you are, and the more like mashallah, gambling. So they'd gamble like their whole house, like you gambled everything away, and then they lose everything. But it was a very common part of culture to expect people to gamble like that very recklessly. And generally, again, Allah refers to this time their kind of mentality. أَإِذَا كُنَّا تُرَابًا أَإِنَّا لَفِي خَلْقٍ جَدِيدٍ. When we become dust, the concept of a hereafter was non-existent. So the purpose of living was to live for the moment. So to get drunk now, to enjoy this, to get, and even when it's gambling, like we may think gambling is a logical thing you do to make more money. But obviously also we know now with psychological studies, it's got a lot to do with the hit you get when you're about to put your whole life on the line. So it was kind of that short-term hit, wow, like, I might win this. And just to get that momentary pleasure, they would give up everything. Same with getting drunk. You're kind of, it's escapism, escaping from the real world. Get high, so you're away from the real world. That was the kind of life they were living, short-term pleasure, not really thinking. And these are important, really important, because when we think of what the Prophet ﷺ brought, ultimately his message was going to take them away from short-term pleasure. And you can't just fulfill your desires in the short term just because you feel like it. So Kitab al-Asnam was one of the books. And in this book, his reference is quite good as well. If you get a chance, you can references to different check. Then you can check all the references. But that's what last one time talks about. About the Arabs generally, that's the kind of people they were. Obviously, they had their slaves. In terms of a woman, the worst thing that we kind of realize is that if a daughter was born, it was kind of, they had a whole custom, they had a whole practice, they had a whole way of dealing with it. They would get embarrassed, they would get sad, they would kind of go, and people would come and it's almost like somebody's died. They would come to their house and what do we call it? You go and visit them, and you kind of oh, don't worry, everything would be okay. And in many cases, as we know, again, the Quran mentions this about the baby when they're born, how they would bury them alive, basically the girl. So if they had a girl, because of the embarrassment, they would bury them alive. Those that would survive, and obviously when we have the companions, they would mention the narration that some of the lady companions, they survived because their parents didn't have that kind of audacity, didn't have the will to bury anything alive, even though they may have done it before, but they couldn't do it again. So, and obviously Islam came and gave these rights. But when we think of, even though it was alive and born, it didn't have a right to existence. The Quraysh would think that because it's a female, it actually doesn't have a right to exist. We don't have to look after it. Beyond that, obviously, we have the inheritance. So a woman didn't have any right to inheritance. In fact, very often they would be inherited. Even in the Roman and the Persian empires, females would basically, if the female's husband died, then they would just become the possession of the brother of that husband. So the husband dies, then the brother of that kind of just becomes inherited, just like everything else. So there was no rights for them. There was no rights. And there's one story actually. Some of the tribal chiefs would often buy some girls to sing their lives. There's a name by Saksa Najiya. Before the dawn of Islam, he had rescued 300 girls by paying their fathers. Obviously, one of the reasons also was girls are less likely to be able to grow up and contribute back to your family. It's a very tribal society. You have boys, they grow up, they earn a bit, they kind of get married, and they look after themselves. When it's a girl, you have to welcome, or you have to send her away, but then they don't really send anything back to you. Whereas when it's a boy, even if he goes away with the girl, he's looking after the family and that kind of thing. So very often the parents just wouldn't have that within them to look after a girl and to have that for a girl. There's different kind of the different caste system would have a different kind of oppression for girls as well, and basically they weren't looked after, they weren't treated as humans. So obviously when we see the Prophet come, and so sometimes we get confused, even with the concept of slavery. That we realized before Islam there was a concept of slavery, then we had slave trade 200 years ago, 300, it was finished in the 1800s. 200, less than 250 years ago, we had ships coming from America full of slaves, half of them dying on the way. So when people think of slavery, they think of something different. When we think of what Islam came and the Quran speaks about the rules of slavery, you can only understand slavery from an Islamic perspective if you kind of realize that it's a bit different to the slave trade. And it's different to what slavery was before Islam came. The reason I'm saying this now is because the way females were treated was unacceptable. But then Islam came and started giving all these rights to females in the way to actually liberate females from their kind of oppression from before. And sometimes we look at that and we think, and we compare it to liberalism as we understand today. We don't actually understand how much Islam actually gave these rights to people. It's the same with slavery. So Islam's purpose was to abolish slavery, and while it abolished slavery, it started to give more and more rights to the slave. So to have a slave under Islam wasn't actually it had so many conditions that it wasn't possible. Like the slave trade, the way it happened, would not have been allowed under Islam. So people don't always realize that, and that's why they get confused. Why does Islam encourage the slave trade and things like this, for example? It always helps when we have that context. Even now, when we want to understand how much light the Prophet ﷺ bring, when we understand the darkness the world was in, when we understand how backwards the people had gone, when we realize how morals had kind of completely disappeared from society, then we start studying the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, and we think of the world he had to work in. It really helps us understand how much of an effect he had and how much he transformed society. But those were the three kind of main areas I wanted to look at: the Persians and the Romans, and obviously India has a lot of things. There's a few different things which can be looked at. The one thing I wanted to look at was kind of the richer people. So obviously we understand poor people are slaves, and we're kind of looking at that. But the economic system was such that the richer people had a desire for wealth, and very often no concept of akhirah, no concept of life after death. So their living was for the moment. So that's why when you start studying their treasures and how the people who actually ruled, how they accumulated their wealth, they would tax harshly, oppressive way, and they did tax so the tax comes into them. When the tax came in, they had no morals. Like here, when we see the life of the Prophet ﷺ and things coming into Bayt al-Mal, it's very different to things coming into the possession of the Emperor of Rome. For him, then we would see that the amount they would use on there's some examples here. So the treasuries of the Iranian empires. So they already had places, but basically these people, they would find different ways to compete. So the Romans, remember, were competing with the Persians in terms of this luxury. So in terms of gold bars, how many gold bars could the Roman Empire kind of accumulate in their treasury? Well, the Persians would have to compete with them. If they were making castles in Persia, then the Romans would have to compete with the Persians. It was kind of competition to see who could have more. Also, the defense system would often be in competition with one another. So that's the kind of things that they would have. So one example of this is the Iranians, especially the Persians, once they had to move the treasure, so they had to move into a new building. This was the start of the process. And he had 468 million mithqal of gold. And by the 13th year of his reign, the accumulation of gold had reached 800 million mithqals. So he started off with 375, he was reigning, he was accumulating wealth, he was taking wealth from the people around it, and he more than doubled it in his reign. So it wasn't like the kings were there, like serving the people and really caring. The king's purpose was to just be there and looked after. In Iran, the kings were considered divine. Whatever they said would go, and people just look after them in that way. So really, there wasn't like a moral running of the country. Generally, there wasn't like a moral way for people to decide how to live. So there was oppression, and as much oppression as they could do and get away with, that's how much they would do. So that's basically an overview of those three parts of the world, and we're at about 9:30. For today, inshallah, I do like to spend a bit longer on the series. I do want to do that spiritual thing like before Isha, but Isha's at 10 o'clock. Isha's at 10 o'clock, so the adhan will be about 10 minutes before that. If what we can try and do, for those of us that are staying for Isha anyway, if we can try and come back to the masjid for at least like 10 minutes before Isha and listen to the adhan and then try and like get ready for Isha. And then now, inshallah, I'll let the sisters first, if they're hanging around, if you're staying for Isha. Get yourself some tea if you want, and coffee, a really clever time to drink coffee. There's hot chocolate as well if you wanted that, or whatever you want. If there's any questions, I can take questions now. But today's purpose was just to really get a bit of an idea of the world. That we have like details about the whole world. Obviously, Roman Empire, Persian Empire, Arabia, just three main parts, so we can get a bit of a deeper understanding. Next week, inshallah, we'll start looking at an actual birth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah, I'm a little bit ill today as well, so excuse. But inshallah, it does get more interesting as we go through. Then we look at the birth and see how it comes. If there's no question, inshallah, this is all the stuff's there basically if you want to do it yourself. And then obviously you guys can relax at the back room. And then we'll have Isha 10 o'clock. I take the chairs, sister. I can leave the chair. They leave your chair, we'll take it. Yeah.